somebody who's been watching from far afield. New York City is our U.S. correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, because comparatives are being drawn with the U.S. elections and those here in South Africa, that South Africans vote for a political party and not individuals, as we've just been discussing, and as is the custom in the United States. Well, tomorrow, various local and state level elections are taking place in the United States, including in New York City, where new mayor, city council, and local leaders will be elected. Our U.S. correspondent is Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and he joins us now to discuss the two systems. Sherwin, great to have you. Always good to have you on the program. And an interesting day here in South Africa, local government elections, and we're busy trying to unpack why people didn't turn out. Is this a battle that happens in the United States as well?
Well, I was just running the numbers a short time ago, looking back at the presidential election. So you had the federal election in the United States last year, of course, the one that dragged on due to the pandemic. Absentee ballots, postal ballots, of course, a big conversation point in terms of making it easier for Americans to participate in that election due to the pandemic. So perhaps something for South Africa to think about. Another issue, in terms of this discussion about low voter turnout, is that some countries like Argentina, Brazil, Australia have laws that make it compulsory for anyone that is eligible to vote. So if it's 18 years and above or 21 years and older, you have to show up to vote, or you have to cast a ballot. So there are ways in which perhaps has become time for South Africa to look at how to make it easier for people to vote. We accommodate older people, for example, in the special votes where you go to the homes of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for example, because they're too frail or too old to show up at a polling station. But to look at more broadly how to make those kinds of situations more plausible for the wider electorate. And of course, when you talk about absentee ballots, Peter, you look, for example, at a stable post office. The post office will be key. Will it be secure? How will they be able to secure the ballot that goes into the post box and shows up at a polling station where those ballots need to be tabulated? So there's an infrastructure that would need to be developed to make it easier for people. But the two systems, of course, very different. In South Africa, you vote for the party. So the anomaly really, in a sense, is that a lot of these, in terms of these local government voters, they don't know who their mayor is going to be if they're voting for a particular party. There was a story over the weekend that the ANC would only be interviewing candidates for mayoral positions post the election. So you're essentially voting blind, whereas in the United States, it's the first past the post system. Essentially, if you win a plurality of votes, you win that election. That will be the case in New York. There's an election in Boston, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in Seattle, Washington, in Dallas, Texas, and similar local government elections. I spoke to Professor Sean Jacobs. He's a professor of international affairs at the New School University. Of course, he's also a South African. He worked for IDASA back in the day, the now defunct IDASA, the Institute for Democracy in South Africa. So he understands both systems. This is how he talked about the pros and cons in both. Watch.
I would say that the South African system, the bad side of the South African system is the fact that it's so heavily controlled by the political parties. I mean, to the result we're having now in this current local election, where the ANC basically announces that it will pick its mayoral candidates after the election. So a voter voting, you're basically voting for the ANC. You have no sense of who that candidate is. You haven't met them. They don't campaign. You know nothing about their personality, their ethics, etc. You just have to trust the political party. The difference with the US is, as I said, you actually see the candidate, they're campaigning, you see their personality. The downside with the US and the issue of the candidate is that it becomes just about personality and very little about the political ideas, about the policies, because the party only provides you with the infrastructure to try to win, but the party can't control what your campaign is about. They can't say they can't control your policies. They can just try to help you to win. It's a different limit that they have on what you can do.
So it's a party that can essentially just help you win. And I think the point here, Peter, two P's: personality in terms of the individual that you're voting for, or party. And I think one of the best examples that really encapsulates the power of the individual is Donald Trump's successful nomination as the candidate that would represent the Republican Party in that election in 2016. Not essentially a stalwart of the party. He was a fresh face on the political scene. People questioned his Republican credentials. The party machinery was very reluctant initially to get behind him, but that personality won the day, and the party then had to get behind Donald Trump. And now it's more sort of Trump's party than it is perhaps the Republican Party of old conservative values. And that really does talk about the importance in the United States of the personality, the individual over the party. You know, the ANC has more power over its candidates or its nominees than, say, a Republican Party or a Democratic Party in the United States.
If the party is sort of sick and tired, or they're not happy with the way that the candidate is performing as mayor, it's very easy for them to what they call recall them. Well, the ANC uses the word deploy, right? Here it's harder. You have to start a referendum process, which is expensive. You need certification for it. You need to run special elections. There's like one place where there's an exception, and that's California. Yeah, and I don't know if people know, but in California, there's often like some kind of recall election endlessly. But in other parts of the U.S., it's really it's much harder to get rid of the person. The person can serve their full term. Bill de Blasio, at the end, he became really unpopular. He's very unpopular in New York, but he will stay there till the end. Whereas in South Africa, whether it's at local level, provincial or national level, remember Thabo Mbeki was removed. Recently, the ANC also tried to remove Jacob Zuma at various attempts. So that's one difference between the two systems, is that in the South African system, if a party has a political program and it wants to implement that program, hopefully to make things better, then it's able to get rid of the person that they're not happy with.
And really, just to give you an example of how difficult it is to dislodge an unpopular mayor, for example, despite their disapproval numbers escalating. Bill de Blasio, the incumbent mayor of New York, who will serve out a term until early January and will be replaced by the winner in tomorrow's election, Peter, his approval rating is around 37%. So his Democratic Party might not have been in his corner necessarily based on those numbers, but they had no power as, say, an ANC or a DA or EFF might have in terms of recalling or removing or redeploying a candidate. The last part here is you have an independent electoral commission in South Africa. In the United States, it's a more convoluted system. It's based on different states and different regions and localities. They have a system called the New York Board of Elections in New York. It's made up of 4 commissioners, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. So it's convoluted in a sense that party persuasions might influence how these operatives, these commissioners work within that system. But of course, the 2 parties are there to check on each other. This is how Sean Jacobs talked about the election boards in the States.
In the US are organized by local electoral commissions. The problem is here in the US, those can be heavily partisan. So in South Africa, you have an independent electoral commission that organizes elections. In the US, they call them boards, electoral boards. But these electoral boards, whoever's in power, they dominate that electoral board. So the whole process sounds nonpartisan, but in effect, parties end up controlling the process.
Yeah, so a complex situation in terms of elections in the United States. But here's an anomaly, Peter. We have one almost every year. There's always an election season in the United States. Unlike in South Africa, we had presidential elections last year. All members of Congress were elected last year. We have these regional, local, state elections this year. Next year, of course, all members of Congress and a third of the Senate will be on the ballot. So every year seems to be an election year. So it's always going to be a conversation point between the two of us, Peter.
Different about American politics and politics here is that there really are 2 main parties in the US, whereas here we're getting more and more parties. I went to vote today and my first ballot had 29 names on there. And, if you are not mindful of what these parties represent, you literally are just going to look for the one that made the most noise, perhaps, on social media. But the question I really want to ask you is, here we really have had a disappointing turnout and apathy by young voters. Is that the same in the United States as well? Even though we've discussed these similarities and perhaps things that are not the same, young people are the same around the world, but do the ones in America show up?
We thought they would, particularly after the George Floyd incident that really galvanized the youth movement in terms of, around the issue of police brutality, particularly against black and brown men in this country. But overall, Peter, it's the older people that vote everywhere. I mean, it's older people in Florida that turn up and sway the election towards Republicans in one of those important swing states. So older people tend to show up, especially in off-presidential elections. So when you don't have a big name like a Biden or a Trump or a Clinton or an Obama on the ballot, those numbers tend to taper off. And I think that is evidenced in the numbers you're seeing in South Africa. But I think in South Africa also you have to understand that things have been complicated by a very dire economic situation, a lot of uncertainty created by COVID-19, and a fiscus that has been very, very much reduced by this pandemic. So there are a number of factors. There's obviously disillusionment, I think, with the political climate in South Africa, but that's not unique to South Africa. That happens everywhere. You do, though, have remedies. When they talk about increasing quotas in terms of women's representation in power, they say you have to implement laws to do that. South Africa could, for example, discuss what it might look like to have voting compulsory, like some countries do around the world. That might shore up the numbers in terms of these elections. But the big concern here is when you get 30%, 40% turnout, what sort of sample is that of an electorate that is much, much vaster than that? And are you now electing candidates based really on a minority of voters rather than the broader consensus might seek to achieve? So it's complex, Peter, and a lot of it above my pay grade, I'm afraid.
I mean, it's a big ask, I guess, to expect that South Africa's elections might even hit the radar on American news cycles there. But I just wonder, maybe the South African community in New York, where you stay, excuse me, is this a conversation that they're having so far away?
It's not a big conversation. There's so many competing issues right now. You have the COP26 conference, you've just had the G20, and then you have American politics very focused on what, for example, the outcome of the governor's race in Virginia is going to be. Virginia is a former Republican purple-leaning state that has turned blue in the last number of years. Biden won the state by 10 points. So the focus is on whether the Biden ally, Terry McAuliffe, the former Democratic governor of that state, is seeking re-election against a Republican will. They're looking at this as a sort of referendum on how Biden has done so far, literally 10 months into his presidency. So that really is the focus here. I'm sure South Africans are logging on digitally to see what's going on back home, but certainly in terms of the media narrative in the United States, not a lot of plug given to the local government elections in South Africa. But just going back to an earlier point you made, Peter, about the long number of candidates and the confusion that might create on the ballot paper, I can one-up you. In the United States, they don't just vote for councillors and mayors. They vote for sheriffs. They vote for the comptroller, essentially the accountant that is in charge of a city's finances. They vote for judges. They vote for all manner of things, borough president, city advocate. Everything is on the ballot. And on occasion, voters can directly vote about an issue. Do you want to legalize marijuana? Do you want to, put a sign up at the city entrance that says something about, not attacking bears? These are some of the issues where voters have a direct say on what a state law or a city law will be. So there's very, very much an engagement with the citizenry in the United States in terms of the project of elections. It's not just, vote for the president or vote for the party. There are real issues, as it pertains to local government, the sheriff, the local judge, the accountant that's going to be controlling a city's finances, where you directly vote those people into power. So it's much more detailed in the United States than perhaps the situation in South Africa, Peter.
Sherwin, I'd be totally voted out completely with all those different people I'd have to vote for. But Sherwin, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good chatting to you in this fascinating comparison between South Africa and the United States. Thanks very much, my brother. We'll chat again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, that's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our New York correspondent, making those connections, comparisons, and also things that are slightly different in the United States with our own local government elections.